Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. I wanted to give you a sort of a preview of our Sunday school class for this Sunday. I wanted to sort of have a conversation with all of you just on a topic and it's a topic in Christian bioethics, and the subject is gene editing. A few weeks ago, Tim Hall came into my office and showed me an editorial written by Walter Isaacson in the Wall Street Journal entitled "What Gene Editing Can Do for Humankind," and it raises some questions as to the current state of things within Christian bioethics. Gene editing is a topic I knew almost nothing about, and so I tried to do a little bit of research via Google to learn a little bit to kind of help facilitate the conversation. Just a few things, perhaps, to kind of get us up to speed. In 2020, two scientists were awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for their 2014 pioneering work in developing the CRISPR Cas9 genetic scissors. This proved to be a powerful and efficient tool for editing the DNA in plants, animals, and even humans. In 2017, researchers at the Salk Institute used the CRISPR to successfully remove a genetic mutation responsible for certain heart defect. And after removing the particular sequence, the DNA healed back without the defect, essentially removing the mutation from that fertilized egg. And so, hypothetically, as the egg then would grow and the cells would reproduce and form a human fetus, it would no longer have that certain defect. In this particular case, the fertilized eggs were destroyed after 3 days. In 2018, it was announced that a Chinese scientist used CRISPR to edit the gene sequence of two embryos, which were later delivered as twin girls. CRISPR, it was said, changed the DNA of these two girls to make them more resistant to HIV infection. This act was widely condemned by the scientific community, but all of this does raise important questions regarding the ethics. We are at a unique point in our history. Our ability to affect change in the human body raises a host of ethical questions. As Christians, we need the wisdom to apply Christian principles effectively and thoroughly to these questions. While there are promising new advances in cures for genetic diseases, there's also the potential for gene enhancement, also known as designer babies, where we enhance desired heritable traits like height, intelligence, athleticism, and the rest. The ethical questions relate both to the methods used in genetic research as well as the intended purpose for this research. Genetic editing can entail a variety of methods, and I'm not going to try to make you think I'm an expert in any of this, but these are just some things that I've noticed as I was reading on the subject. For example, as we think of the research in this and the use of genetic manipulation, you have in vitro versus in vivo. That is, if you're treating the cells or using cells in a petri dish, that's in vitro, or if you're using it in a living organism, it's called in vivo. And what you can or can't do, or the ethics behind doing either one of those, there are questions that relate to that. There are also different cells in which genetic and gene-altering therapy can be applied to. There's germline cells and somatic cells. Germline cells are the reproductive cells that are responsible for passing down genetic traits. So within the male, it's the sperm; it's in the female, it's the egg, and and in those two together are the is the sort of the agent that passes inherited traits from one generation to the next. Somatic cells are cells within the body of a particular individual, and so you might have a brain cell or a stomach cell or a liver cell or something like that that don't have the the ways or means of replicating themselves or passing down heritable traits. There's also what's called epigenetic therapy, and this refers to therapy. It's not the CRISPR that we looked at or are looking at, but it does refer to a therapy that, while it doesn't affect a change in one's DNA, it uses engineered chemicals to trigger particular gene responses that may normally lie dormant or prevent particular gene responses from happening. And so, even though it doesn't change your DNA, it does affect how your DNA might respond. Epigenetic can also refer to the fact that our genes do respond to outside influence. And so, genetic changes can occur because of outside things. Like we know that smoking it relates to lung cancer, and it's very likely that smoke has an epigenetic effect on the genes that could lead to lung cancer in many, for example, or pollution or other things, even trauma, have epigenetic effects on our DNA. So we're at a unique point in our history. I feel like I read this already. Yeah, sorry. Gene editing can entail a variety of intended purposes. So we looked at some methods. There's also intended purposes. For example, the treatment of existing diseases, such as certain cancers, are involved. Disease prevention, prevention of genetic defects. For example, we are at that stage with CRISPR where we're not far away from potentially being able to manipulate the human gene to eliminate or at least reduce the possibility of Down syndrome or something like a congenital heart defect. And then, even though we're not quite here yet, theoretically and hypothetically, we are coming very close to a place where we can be involved in gene enhancement by heightening the probability of having desirable or desired heritable traits, like intelligence or athleticism, something like that. So, as we think about these things, we do need to keep in mind some important Christian principles that have been long established and that they're supported by Scripture that help us to think about some of these issues. And I've listed 6, and I'm opening the door for any more that you might be able to think of and want to add to this list as we talk about it. The first thing that comes to my mind is the fact of the Imago Dei. All people are created in the image of God. There are essential features of being human that point to the divine. And for this reason, all people have an inherent dignity and glory. Any and all scientific or medical research must be committed to the dignity of the human being. Further, the Imago Dei informs us that humans, as humans, we are creative agents in the world, imitating our Father by way of analogy. Our God is a creative God. He creates heavens and the earth. Well, people too are creative. We don't create out of nothing like God did, but we create using our own creative abilities and gifts and using the raw materials of God's creation. So the pursuit of knowledge and the pursuit of technology is really a positive good but qualified. It's when it's used in a way consistent with Christian principles. Technology and knowledge, has a sense of neutrality to that. We know how to split an atom, but that can result in a weapon in war, or it could result in the production of inexpensive energy. I mean, there are things that can be used for good or bad purposes. And so we need to be careful and ready to qualify. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should do something. But at the same time, I don't want us to go too far the other direction, that just because something is new, it must be bad. There's sort of a balance there that needs to be achieved. Furthermore, along with Imago Dei, we are stewards of creation, and that includes other people. Humans are called to act as stewards who care for creation, and such stewardship entails caring for the well-being of living creatures, including one another. And so we think of this sixth commandment that thou shalt not commit murder. It's important for us to seek the well-being of all of those around us, and especially those in our immediate care. Third, God deeply and intimately expresses his care for all people in that even before we were born, as fertilized eggs, God knit us together. And of course, we have that beautiful passage from Psalm 139, how we are fearfully and wonderfully made by our Creator and knit together in the inward parts. And so there is a commitment to the fact that children, especially newborns, and all people express this reality of God's personal and intimate care. Furthermore, humans procreate in one flesh relationships. The results of these one flesh relationships are children whom we receive as begotten gifts. It's important when we talk about genetic engineering, a lot of it has to do, not all of it, but a lot of the emphasis on moving forward in this field has a lot to do with genetically altering the DNA or the gene sequences within embryos, because it's at that stage where the reproduction of that particular corrected trait is most easily multiplied in the person, and so that causes us then to reflect too on the importance of children, that they are gifts from God, that they are given to us, and we are to care for them. And so it raises questions when we want to make changes. Of course, it just raises the questions of how important that is, and where we need to be cautious. 5, because humans are bearers of God's image, they deserve our protection, especially the weak and the vulnerable. And this would especially speak to children and the unborn. Finally, we have a fallen tendency towards sin. Our sinful condition as humans entails a proclivity to transgress God's law. We're susceptible to sinful behavior. And so it is good for there to be restraints against this reality. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, Romans 3:23 tells us. And even before the fall, God created certain boundaries for Adam and Eve. And so even our conceptions of what we can do and ought to do or able to do needs to be carefully considered, that even before the fall, God placed boundaries. And so and if that's the case, how much more should we consider that important in our sinful condition? And then finally, I just listed, there's some others that come to mind. So I'd like you to be thinking about this before Sunday. And I don't pretend that this is an exhaustive list. It's sort of suggestive, things that came to my mind right away. And so I want to encourage you to think of some other things too. Finally, there are, as we said, morally problematic areas in this discussion. One area that's morally problematic is the use of in vitro fertilization. And the problem here is that this typically entails the destruction of multiple fertilized eggs, which goes to the question of when does life begin and what's the moral status of an embryo. Now there's room for some discussion here, but typically, and rooted in Scripture, the consistent sort of answer that the church has given is that from the very beginning, God is at work in this human life, and so the in vitro in the process of inseminating the egg in an in vitro process, typically what happens is that you have multiple eggs that are fertilized, and then those that are deemed the best of that batch are used, and others will either be maybe frozen in case, like if you're looking for a child to have a child, they'll be frozen, or in some research cases, maybe they'll just be destroyed and thrown away. Well, that does raise real ethical questions as to the morality of that process, and it is the case that a lot of gene research involves in vitro fertilization. Another area that's problematic, especially if we're looking at the idea of changing children or their genetic makeup to have traits that we desire, there is a sense in which we can almost turn them into commodities rather than gifts. And Dr. Francis Collins, who is a Christian and also the director of the National Institutes of Health, has a quote where he says, "The application of germline manipulation would change our view of the value of human life. If genomes are being altered to pursue or to suit parents' preferences, do children become more like commodities than precious gifts?" And that's a real poignant question that Dr. Collins asked. And I should note that Dr. Collins was one of the lead members of the Human Genome Project, so he's very much in the know in that field. And of course, this raises questions about blurring lines between what is good and what is desired, and sometimes those can be blurred. It does seem good that we want to treat and prevent disease, but at the same time, there's always that tendency to fulfill our desires rather than what we see as a common good or the benefit for all, and so there is definitely a problematic area in the tendency to break toward our desires rather than merely be content with the common good. And then there's the unknowability of unintended consequences. In one of the things I was reading in the literature with CRISPR, they will talk about on-target and off-target gene connections with CRISPR. That essentially, what I picture the process is the introduction of a certain enzyme that enables them to cut a certain portion of the gene sequence, and either it will be healed normally, or it will be replaced or removed, and so, but that making that connection of targeting the right gene sequence is something that isn't always foolproof. There may be other gene sequences in the DNA that are similar enough to the targeted gene that it misses, and it eliminates something else, and could cause problems, and then you have the unintended consequences of not knowing what that all might entail. Anyway, as you can imagine, it's a tough question, and it's a tough issue. There is a lot of great things that could come from this, but there are also a lot of real questions and potential real problems about this as well. And so as Christians, we want to be thoughtful, but we also want to stand by our convictions and sort of address these issues and be able to understand these issues so that as a part of the larger a community, we can participate in pointing people to the light of what is good, so hopefully you'll get something from this class. It'll be kind of fun to hear what you guys have to say. I really respect the wisdom of everyone that comes, and so I look forward to our time on Sunday. So with that, I'll close this file.